I had a care provider that really didn't care for me. For around 30 weeks, when he threw my birth plan in the trash, that I thought maybe I should switch care providers. I just thought this behavior was normal. Labor rolls along. Don't try to be admitted tonight. I won't admit you. Came home, labored for 16 hours at home before I tried to be admitted. I wasn't allowed to get up. They said, "Can you hold it?" Whenever I wanted to get to the bathroom. Finally, he gets there. He says, "You're not doing this right. You can't do this. Just stop." This was with coached pushing. I only pushed for 15 minutes. 5 of those minutes he couldn't handle with me in the room. He was too frustrated, so he left. Placed back on my chest, and I feel so detached, and I'm so afraid to tell anyone. I love her so much, but I'm like afraid of her. Aching, and I'm literally sick to my stomach, but I don't tell anyone. I didn't sleep at all the next night. So, like, this is birth. This is the most meaningful time of my life, and I can't enjoy it. I can't enjoy my new baby. Time my baby wanted to nurse, every time I had to do something with her, I would just shake and feel so sick. I didn't know that I needed to be an advocate for myself. I didn't know how to verbalize what I was feeling, because every time I tried to, someone would say, "That's normal, you just gave birth, give yourself time, give your body time to heal." It wasn't normal. So he sees me at 11 weeks postpartum. He says, "You're probably never gonna lose this baby weight." I was terrified to have children after that.
My traumatic birth happened with my oldest son, who was born in 2012. I had a hospital birth with him with an OB. I was planning to have an all-natural birth. Just thought, I'll have a hospital birth with my first one. I'll stick to my guns, avoid all of the interventions, and everything will be fine. I'll have my mom with me. That was the plan. The morning after my due date, I woke up to my water breaking. I had been tested for GBS and I was positive. If you are a mom in the US and you are having a hospital birth with an OB and your water breaks, any thoughts of having a natural birth kind of go flying out the window. My water was slowly leaking. I tried to hold off for as long as I possibly could, and that afternoon I had a nice gush and said, "Okay, fine, I'll give them a call and head in and get the antibiotics." I was able to hold off of Pitocin until the next morning. I ended up pushing for 3.5 hours. It was not moving. They were doing coached pushing, even though I did not have an epidural and I could feel, my urges. It just did not feel natural at all. Once I got to like 6 or 7, every time they were counting, I just wouldn't feel that urge to push anymore. So those last 3 or 4 seconds, every single time, it just felt like so much wasted energy. It was just terrible, and that lasted for 3.5 hours. I was so exhausted because obviously I couldn't eat anything or drink anything the whole time I was in the hospital, which at this point was, almost 24 hours, pushing ineffectively. So the OB comes in and says, "Look, I know you don't want a C-section, so I think we should do a vacuum." At that point, I was like, that's fine, whatever. I was just so exhausted. The vacuum, and he came out in, 1 contraction. What I didn't know that she did at that point was she also gave me an episiotomy, which apparently that's something that you're supposed to just assume is part of doing a vacuum. But she never told me that she was doing an episiotomy. She just mentioned the vacuum. Didn't find out that I had an episiotomy until actually when I was pregnant with my next son. When she did the episiotomy, and then pulled him out with the vacuum, I tore the rest of the way to a 4th-degree tear. That was pretty rough. It is painful. It's a long recovery from your vagina to your rectum, and they have to do a lot of stitching up, and it takes a long time to heal, a long time for you to be able to have sex without pain, to not have pain with bowel movements. There's just a lot of side effects that come along with severe tearing.
I gave birth to my son Roman in September 2017. I gave birth at home in a big pool of water with my husband, a midwife, the midwife's assistant, and a doula. My birth trauma is a little double whammy. I am a sexual assault survivor, and I was unaware that birth could be so triggering. I was so triggered during birth that I dissociated and zoned out, and my midwife had to coach me back in pretty heavily a few times. After my birth of my son was successful, my placenta never detached. After my midwife tried to manually scrape it out, which is excruciating, we had to call 911. So about 6 EMTs and firefighters entered my apartment while I laid on my couch bleeding naked and carried me out naked on a stretcher under a white sheet, like a dead person. So we had to go to the emergency room where the doctor tried to scrape it out again by hand. They still couldn't get it, so then they had to take me to the OR and pump me full of all the drugs that I had opted out of when giving birth to my son, including a spinal tap. They got it out, and then I had to be in the hospital for about 12 hours, which they tried to continue to keep me in. I lost so much blood that I was on bed rest for 7 weeks. I think one of the hardest parts was I chose to leave my son at home when we went to the hospital. I didn't want to admit him through the ER, so I left him at home with our doula and the midwife's assistant, and that was a lot of guilt of leaving my newborn son at 1 hour old at home away from me. I would end up having lots of breastfeeding issues and kind of detachment from him, and I blame that a lot on being away from him at the beginning of our birth. It was rough. I didn't tell my family or friends anything about going to the hospital for months. I told my husband not to tell anybody. I had a lot of feelings that I couldn't put words to, a lot of shame about my birth not being the way I had planned it. I am terrified of giving birth again. I really want another home birth. I really want more babies, and I would love them to be birthed at home. But I don't know if unmedicated home birth is in my cards anymore. That makes me really sad. I understand that a placenta that does not detach is not common. It did not happen with my first birth. It probably will not happen again. So that's not the part I'm fearful of. I am fearful of the survivor part being triggered, and I don't know if that was related at all to the placenta not detaching.
It's my son's 3rd birthday today, and a lot of you know that I had a cesarean with him because he was breech, and no one would support me in having a vaginal birth. And I knew that I could do it, that my body could have this baby vaginally, and no one supported me. And I want you to see that 3 years later, how much this still affects me. And on his birthday every year, still relive being scared and fearful and crying and not wanting to have a cesarean and being strapped down and just feeling cold tears hit my ears as I'm laying there being the last person to see him. I felt forced. I felt like something was wrong with me. I felt like something was wrong with my baby, and I just so desperately wanted to have him naturally, and I was just so lost. I don't want people to ever experience the feeling that I go through when I think about his birth. And yes, I love him, and when I saw him, all those feelings melted away, and wondering if I was ever gonna be able to have a baby vaginally in the future. He's healthy, and above all, I'm grateful for that. But I'm suffering with what I went through. I suffer all the time.
I had a traumatic pregnancy and birth. I never actually made it to labour because I had a health condition at the end of my pregnancy that necessitated a emergency cesarean to save the life of me and my child. My trauma comes from the near-death experience and postpartum period rather than having any poor medical care. And I have to say the NHS and I live in Colchester. I was at Colchester Hospital. The team there were excellent. I cannot fault the care I had, but it was a big shock to be having such a terrible pregnancy and then having the birth I did. It was a lot for me to take on, and I suffered mentally through that. I wasn't really aware. I had felt this. I felt very angry and I felt very sad all the time, and I had these very, very big undulations of emotion. I couldn't control how I was feeling, or I couldn't remember very much. I look back now and I just see that I was under a lot of stress all the time, and I was replaying bits where I was in the hospital. In my mind, I knew my mind was having trouble processing things, and it took my family members to say to me to get some help. My mother, well, she asked if I had postnatal depression, and I said to her, "No, Mum, I'm just miserable," because I wasn't depressed. But it was in January 2018 that my husband came home and he said, "You need to get some professional help or we're not going to make it." And that really hit home to me how awful I was, like how impossible I'd become to live with. I was so unstable emotionally, and I'd had some very dark and unusual thoughts about my parenting skills and my connection with my son.
You will not be silenced, and we will shine light on you in the darkness, because your story matters.